April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man in space. A moment of triumph, a victory for the Soviet Union. But what if he wasn't the first? What if someone else was up there before him? Someone the world was never meant to know about. This is the story of the Lost Cosmonaut Conspiracy Theory, and why even today we still might not know the full truth.
Soviet people had opened a new era, the era of space conquest.
That Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation.
The entire globe is today the site of a momentous conflict, as each side attempts to prove to the world the superiority of its position. The conflict is fought indeed on every level of man's experience, for the stakes are high.
In the 1950s and 60s, space wasn't just about science. It was about power. The Cold War rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union played out across multiple arenas: military strength, economic systems, and propaganda. But nowhere was this competition more visible than the race to conquer the cosmos. For both nations, spaceflight was more than just an engineering feat. It was a way to demonstrate the superiority of their political and economic systems. The first nation to reach key milestones in space would earn global prestige, proving that its way of life, capitalism or communism, was the future. In 1957, the Soviet Union took the lead with Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The metallic sphere, just 23 inches wide, sent simple radio pulses back to Earth. Those beeps, heard around the world, sent an unmistakable message. The USSR was ahead. The launch sent shockwaves through the US, triggering fears that Soviet rockets could be used for more than just satellites. In response, the US ramped up its own space program, creating NASA in 1958. But the Soviets weren't finished. In 1961, they claimed another victory. Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet pilot, became the first human to orbit Earth. The mission was short, just 108 minutes, but it was enough to solidify Soviet dominance in space. Gagarin returned a hero, celebrated not just in the USSR, but around the world. But what if there were others before him? Others who launched, but never returned? In December 1959, a supposed leak from a Czechoslovakian communist official suggested that the Soviets had already sent a man into space, years before Gagarin. If true, it would mean that the first human sent in orbit wasn't celebrated. They were erased. The name? Alexei Ledovsky. According to the claims, he was launched inside a converted RFA rocket, a Soviet ballistic missile repurposed for human spaceflight. But something went wrong. The details are murky. Some accounts say the capsule malfunctioned. Others claim the re-entry was fatal. What's certain is that Ledovsky never appeared in any official Soviet records. And he wasn't alone. More names surfaced over time. Andrei Mitkov, Sergei Shaborin, Maria Gromova, each supposedly part of early classified spaceflight tests, each never acknowledged by Soviet authorities. If these missions really happened, they ended in failure and complete silence. Still, these theories remain rumors until something surfaced that some claim is undeniable proof. March 1961, just weeks before Gagarin's historic flight, two Italian brothers picked up something they weren't meant to hear. Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia, amateur radio operators from Turin, had been eavesdropping on Soviet space transmissions for years. Using repurposed military equipment and a makeshift listening station, they had successfully intercepted signals from Soviet satellites, tracking their trajectories in real time. But on this particular occasion, what they recorded was unlike anything they had ever heard before. A voice. A cosmonaut in distress. The transmission was brief but chilling. A man speaking in Russian, his words broken and labored. The brothers, who had become experts in decoding Soviet messages, believed he was reporting a failure. His spacecraft was overheating. He was struggling to breathe. The panic in his voice was unmistakable. Then, silence. Had they just witnessed the final moments of a doomed cosmonaut? The Judica-Cordiglia brothers would go on to release multiple recordings over the years, each one allegedly capturing lost Soviet space missions that ended in disaster. But this one in particular stood out. The timing was suspicious, happening just mere weeks before Gagarin's successful flight. If another cosmonaut had been launched first and died in orbit, the Soviets would have had every reason to suppress it. The Soviet Union, of course, denied everything. No missions had been lost, they insisted. No cosmonauts had perished. The brothers' recordings, they claimed, were either fabricated or misinterpreted. Skeptics pointed out that the Judica-Cordiglia brothers were self-taught radio enthusiasts, not trained scientists. Could they have misinterpreted a routine transmission? Or worse yet, could they have staged the recordings themselves? Some experts remain unconvinced, arguing that their equipment, while advanced for amateurs, lacked the precision needed to verify such extraordinary claims. Yet others argue that the recordings are difficult to dismiss entirely. The Soviets were known for secrecy, especially when it came to spaceflight failures. Before Gagarin's official mission, there were at least a dozen failed launches, some unmanned, some rumored to be otherwise. If a cosmonaut had died in orbit, covering it up wouldn't be out of character for the USSR. So was this a genuine distress call, or just radio interference misinterpreted by eager listeners? When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, its once impenetrable archives were finally opened. Decades of classified documents, long kept hidden behind the Iron Curtain, became accessible to journalists and historians, eager to uncover the truth about the USSR's space program. If Lost Cosmonauts had been quietly erased from history, this would be the moment their fates would finally be revealed. But there was nothing. No official records confirming failed manned missions, no hidden reports of cosmonauts dying in space. In short, no concrete evidence of a cover-up. For skeptics, this was proof that the Lost Cosmonaut Theory was nothing more than Cold War paranoia. If the Soviets had secretly sent humans to their death in space, why wasn't there a single document proving it? The space program's failures were well documented. Early rocket explosions, failed launches, catastrophic test flights. So why would the deaths of cosmonauts be any different? For believers, the lack of documentation only deepened the mystery. If the Soviets had erased their mistakes, why would they leave behind incriminating evidence? After all, there was precedent for such secrecy. The best example, Valentin Bondarenko. Bondarenko was one of the original cosmonauts selected alongside Gagarin. But in March 1961, just weeks before Gagarin's historic flight, Bondarenko died in a historic training accident. But the Soviet Union refused to acknowledge his death. His name was erased from history, his existence hidden from the public. His fellow cosmonauts were forbidden from speaking about him. It wasn't until 1986, 25 years later, that the truth was finally revealed. If the Soviets could erase Bondarenko, could they erase others? Even before the Soviet Union collapsed, there were hints that something had been concealed. In 1962, Colonel Barney Oldfield, a U.S. Air Force spokesperson, publicly revealed that American intelligence had been tracking an unscrewed Soviet space capsule that had been orbiting Earth since 1960, stuck in its booster rocket. The Soviets never explained the purpose of this mission, or why it remained in orbit for years. If the craft had originally carried a cosmonaut, it would mean that the USSR had sent a human into space, only to leave them stranded. So was this an early attempt at a manned flight, a mistake the Soviets were desperate to keep secret, or just another case of misinformation and speculation? Even decades later, the answers remain elusive. Most historians and experts dismiss the Lost Cosmonaut Theory. No verifiable evidence has ever surfaced. The names of the supposed lost cosmonauts appear in no declassified records. The famous Judica-Cordiglia recordings have never been conclusively authenticated, but Soviet secrecy leaves room for doubt. The space race ended, the USSR fell, but some mysteries never fade.